My name is Robert Myers. I'm the director of the Center for American Studies and Research. And it's wonderful to see so many people here for such an important event. I just want to remind you of a couple of other events that will be upcoming. On December 8th, there will be a talk by David Shumway from Carnegie Mellon about his book on rock stars and his book on John Sayles, the American film director. Much of February here will be devoted to the anniversary of the death of Malcolm X. It will include a talk by Emily Odell, who's on the faculty here at AB, about the relationship between Sudan, and Alex Lubin, who is the former director of CASAR, will come and talk about Malcolm X in the region more generally, and Tarik Mahmoud, who's in the English department, will also be doing an event related to him. In March and April, we'll also have another series of events, and we'll keep you posted. So go to the website if you'd like to get our mailings. Again, thank you so much for coming out. Tonight's guest is David Nevin, who's defended criminal cases throughout the United States for 35 years. He's obtained acquittals in a number of high-profile prosecutions. You can read along with me. Which implicated issues of civil rights and government overreaching, including the 1993 Ruby Ridge case and the 2004 terrorism prosecution of a Saudi Arabian graduate student, Sami Mohamad Al-Hussein. Mr. Nevin currently serves as lead defense counsel for Khalid Sheikh Mohamad in his capital prosecution at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, arising from the attacks on New York and Washington occurring on September 11, 2001. Mr. Nevin received the Idaho State Bar's Distinguished Lawyer Award for 2008. He received the Clarence Darrow Award from the American Civil Liberties Union of Idaho for his defense of Sami Al-Hussein. And Mr. Nevin is a founder and past president of the Idaho Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and is the namesake of its Nevin Professionalism Award. We can ask about that in the Q&A, which the organization awards annually to a criminal defense lawyer who has advanced the ideals of the profession. Mr. Nevin is also a fellow and a former Idaho State Chair of the American College of Trial Lawyers. He serves as an adjunct professor of trial practice at the University of Idaho College of Law and has taught in the EPA's National Trial Advocacy Institute. Mr. Nevin is a frequent lecturer and author on issues involving trial practice, criminal law, and civil rights. His talk tonight will be entitled Defending Khalid Sheikh Mohamad, a Guantanamo Lawyer's Perspective on the Trial of the Century. Please welcome David Nevin.
Send a personal thanks to David. Not only is he here lecturing to you tonight, but he guest lectured in both of my classes, so I have many students here. So thanks for done triple duty, David.
Thank you. And I had a nice seat for my backpack up here so that it would have a nice view of me while I was speaking, but I've asked it to sit on the floor. So if anybody would like to sit down up here, you're welcome to do that. And your good professor changed my computer around, so if anything bad happens, it's all her fault, okay? So let me begin by saying that if we were in the United States, we would be right now exercising core First Amendment rights. We are going to speak and exchange ideas tonight. We have assembled, and we are associating. And in the United States, the First Amendment gives us the right to do all of those things. And I am not one who believes that we're in any particular danger of having those rights taken away on the next bolt of lightning, but I never like to let a meeting like this go by without acknowledging the depth and importance of what we do by coming here. So anyway, thank you all very much for coming. And may I also say that if you decide that you would like to ask some questions along the way, just raise your hand and we can chat. I have some stuff written down here, but the odds are not good that I'll follow it precisely. And so if you want to talk about something, just raise your hand. So this is the problem. I wonder if you know where you were on September 11th of 2001. Some of you are maybe too young to remember, but I know that I remember, just as I remember where I was on the day President Kennedy was shot and killed. And I imagine that I'll remember that all the days of my life, and perhaps you will too. These were terrible events. These buildings collapsed, they caught on fire, people burned to death in these buildings. People jumped out of these buildings and fell hundreds of floors to their deaths on the street below as an alternative to being burned out. This is an horrendous act, and we're going to talk about it tonight. We're going to talk about how and why it happened, some of the events that surround it. But I have to begin by saying that my client, Khalid Sheikh Mohamad, who's alleged to be the principal planner of the events of September 11th, has specifically told me that he doesn't expect me to say to you or to anyone else that the events of September 11th are justified as a matter of law. He asks me to carry a particular message about them, and we'll talk some about that tonight. But nothing that I say tonight and nothing that I say at any time is intended to diminish the extreme significance of these events or to suggest that the victims have not suffered terrible losses and the families of the victims have not. And I keep them in my mind always as I go forward. Terrorism is viewed as an existential threat to the United States, as you know. And to the entire world. In the United States, at least, we know, however, that you are more likely to die by drowning in your bathtub than to die in a terrorist accident. Now, I say that as a matter of statistical fact, but I recognize, as I'm sure all of you will, the difference between random chance injury or death and victimization, outright victimization. On the other hand, there's a seat over here if you'd care to. Just feel free to walk right through here. In fact, if you'd like to say a few words. You okay? Yeah. Okay. But you know what happens, right? We know what happens, at least in the United States. And Alexander Hamilton grasped it in 1784 that what we do when terrible things take place is we react to it because we don't want to feel that we don't want to feel powerless or as if we don't have a response. And so in the United States, this question gets asked a lot: why do they hate us? And maybe not even who are they. But just why do they, whoever they are, why do they hate us? And what we're told in the United States typically is that they hate us because of our freedoms. You know, we get to speak our minds, we get to meet First Amendment, we have freedom from government intrusion, and the Muslims hate us because of that. Because Islam, after all, is a violent religion. And it's all about killing everyone who's not a believer. And that's generally what we're told in the United States, and we'll talk a little bit more about that tonight. So, this is the man I represent, Khalid Sheikh Mohamad. This is one of 3 pictures of him that were extant in the world before his arrest in 2003. The thought is that this, and I would go back if I really knew exactly how to go backwards and forwards. I only know how to go forward. So I'm like Lisa says, I'm like a shark. Oh, you do that? Oh, well, swell. Okay, so you push the backward arrow, in other words. It's very high tech. So do those look like the same picture? I have a suggestion that those are just pictures, the same picture that's been photoshopped. I don't know. But maybe that gets us up to about 4. But the picture that most people of Mr. Mohamad that most people know is this one. This is taken on the night of his arrest, March the 1st of 2003 in Rawalpindi, Pakistan. This is not a picture that I ordinarily show because I think it has a quality of invasion of privacy, but nonetheless, it is an iconic picture. It's one the government puts out. The government puts it out because it carries a particular message. It has a particular, say, you may know that just recently in somewhere in the world, some company that sells hair removal products took this picture and used it in an advertisement and claimed later that they didn't know that this person was an alleged terrorist. But this is what Mr. Mohamad looks like now. This is a picture that was taken actually about a year ago, but it's a pretty good likeness, all in all. He's 50 years old this past April, he's 50 years old. His family is Baloch. His parents were from the Baloch area of Pakistan. They immigrated to Kuwait in the 30s. Khalid Sheikh Mohamad was born in Kuwait, lived and grew up in essentially a Palestinian refugee camp in Fahahil, which is a small town just outside of Kuwait City, and grew up around the Palestinian part of a small part of the Palestinian diaspora, although at that time, my understanding at least is that that was the largest concentration of Palestinians in a single place outside of Palestine. And so there was a very vibrant and very alive Palestinian community, one that he very much identifies with. He's married. He has 8 children. He loves his children. 2 of his children were arrested shortly after the events of September 11th and were tortured themselves by the United States government in an effort to get them to tell something that they didn't know, which was where their father was. But he has 8 children. I've read the letters. They're like the letters that I wrote to my children when they were that age. He is a man who loves his children and who loves his family. He went to the United States to study in the 80s and got a degree in engineering in 1986. And after he graduated from a university in North Carolina in 1986, he came back to Kuwait for a while. But then this was the time of the Afghan jihad, in which the Afghani warlords and as well as the so-called Arab battalions were being united under the umbrella of the United States and were being thrown against the Soviets. And we know, and I know because I know a man who's a retired CIA agent who's told me openly that he sold Stinger missiles to the Afghan Mujahideen, and they used it to shoot down helicopters that the Russians were flying, and soon, as we know, in 1989, the Russians were headed home, and that was seen as a great success. Now, Mr. Mohamad then moves around the world, and there have been a number of books written about this subject. One that you might find interesting is called The Hunt for KSM. But the suggestion is that he went to various places around the world, including the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and that in the process of doing this, he plotted to kill the Pope, plotted to kill President Clinton, worked on the so-called Bojinka plot, that he participated in the first bombing of the World Trade Center with his nephew, Ramzi Youssef, Abdulaziz, and that he engaged in many other terrorist activities. In fact, this is something that he has said, and I'll tell you more about that in just a minute. But Mr. Mohamad is then arrested on March the 1st of 2003 in Rawalpindi, Pakistan. And the next we hear of him is September the 9th of 2006, when President Bush holds a press conference and announces that Mr. Mohamad and 13 other so-called high-value detainees are being taken to Guantanamo Bay, to the military prison at Guantanamo Bay. And so March 1, 2003 to September of 2006 is about 3.5 years, right? Well, during that period, some things occur in Mr. Mohamad's life, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. But you may know that Guantanamo Bay is in the nation of Cuba, and it's here in the lower right-hand corner of Cuba, in other words, the southeast part of Cuba. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, these will, yeah, we can zoom in thanks to Google Earth. And you see there southeast Cuba and the area of Guantanamo, and the bay itself is this area here. It's a beautiful natural bay that provides a wonderful strategic location for ships in the Caribbean, protection from the worst possible hurricanes just naturally. And this is a close-up of the Navy base itself. And so there's an airstrip here where planes land, and there's a former airstrip here where it's abandoned now. So when we arrive at Guantanamo, we come here, and then we take a ferry across to this location. And this area up here is really the administrative part of the naval base. It's a working naval base. And then in other parts of the base, you have the detention operation, which operates separately from the naval base itself. Guantanamo is a place of many contradictions, as you might imagine. It's a Navy base, of course. It's right on the ocean. So there is a lot of natural beauty there, a lot of things that are desirable, and including, by the way, iguanas, which are everywhere. And there are also signs everywhere pointing out that the Endangered Species Act forbids harming iguanas. So it develops that the Endangered Species Act applies at Guantanamo, but the United States Constitution apparently doesn't. And I think that Guantanamo, for all of its beauty, I mean, really all of the beauty is anomalous to the maximum degree. There are grocery stores and gas stations and McDonald's and Starbucks and all of these kinds of things that serve the population of guards and soldiers and lawyers and so on. And so it has the quality of, say, a small town in Iowa. Maybe that's not meaningful to any of you, but just imagine a kind of a bland place that doesn't have very much interesting going on. No Cuban cigars are not available at Guantanamo. In fact, nothing Cuban is available at Guantanamo, with the possible exception of some T-shirts. As you know, and I think some of you I know have studied this issue and will study it more fully in time, but during that 3.5-year period when Mr. Mohamad was not any longer in Rawalpindi, Pakistan, but had not yet arrived at Guantanamo Bay, he was held incommunicado and tortured. And the government has allowed me to say that he was tortured, and it has allowed me to say a few other things. But, you know, it's a remarkable thing for me as an American to just stand here in front of you and say that my government tortured someone. Because I grew up knowing about people like Augusto Pinochet, and we know that ISIS tortures people, and we know that Boko Haram does terrible things, but I was under the impression that my government didn't torture people. In fact, I've spent a lifetime, as I think I've said to some of you previously, I've spent a lifetime as a criminal defense lawyer fighting with the police over how they treated my client before they got him to confess. And they questioned him continuously for 3 hours. You know, and I'm not going to stand for it. I'm going to make them answer for that. They didn't give him a break. They didn't let him get a drink of water. They didn't let him go to the bathroom. That's why he confessed. I'm going to get those police officers up on the witness stand and I'm going to grill them about that because it's not fair, and it isn't. It's a violation of the Fifth Amendment. We put it right in the Bill of Rights that you have a right not to be compelled to be a witness against yourself in the United States of America. Now imagine a person who's spent a lifetime, literally, 40 years, going on 40 years defending criminal cases in the United States, fighting about things like that, being told that my client was held incommunicado and was tortured by my government. That's an astonishing, counterintuitive, crazy kind of thing to hear. But it's true. That's what they did. And you know what torture is, and I think some of you have or will be studying it really in a rigorous intellectual way shortly. But it's the infliction of extreme pain and suffering on another human being in order to coerce them into taking some kind of action. And everybody agrees that it's wrong. Everybody who talks about it and speaks of it intellectually will tell you that it's wrong. All the nations of the world agree that it's wrong. All the nations of the world agree that it's something we don't do. We don't do it to protect our national sovereignty. We don't do it for any reason. We don't do it because we're at war. We don't do it to protect our troops. We don't ever torture anyone. And if it does happen, the Convention Against Torture, which the United States has signed and ratified, the Convention Against Torture requires that the person who is tortured be given the opportunity to be heard in an international body and to demand reparations and to demand inquiry and to be provided information about the nature of the torture. The Convention Against Torture, which we signed, and which our government was just last week in Geneva defending our record on the Convention Against Torture, that's what the Convention Against Torture requires, and it was just like genocide or slavery. It was just among the things that all the nations of the world agreed wouldn't be done. And this is where the idea, you've heard of the Pinochet precedent, of course, in which there is universal jurisdiction for the prosecution of crimes of torture. Not to mention the fact that under US law, under United States domestic law, it's a 20-year felony to torture someone. And plus, on top of that, we have the idea of aiding and abetting. So it's not just me who tortures you, it's the people who gave me permission to torture you. They aid and abet me. Some years ago, the United States did away with the distinction between, there were various distinctions about helping someone before they committed their crime as opposed to helping them escape or get away, accessory after the fact, accessory before the fact, et cetera, et cetera. All of that was done away with under United States law many years ago. And now there's just aiding and abetting. And if you aid, abet, counsel, and encourage a person to commit a crime, then you are just as guilty as they are. So if we all go off to rob a bank together and you go in with the gun, and you look very willing to do that, actually. That's a little alarming. But I drive the getaway car, and someone else is a lookout, and all of us are guilty of robbery. And if, as we jump in the getaway car and we go speeding away, someone steps out into the street and we hit them and kill them, we're all guilty of murder. Even though none of us meant for any of that to happen, we're all guilty of murder. United States law is not very forgiving on these subjects. So think about the President of the United States of America sitting in the White House, deciding whether or not the gloves will come off, as Dick Cheney famously said on Meet the Press. Deciding whether or not we'll have to do some alternative forms of coercion. And President Bush says in his book that he was aware of this and participated in it and approved it, and it makes him guilty of torture. It makes him just as guilty of torture as the people who laid on hands. And the result of that is it controls almost everything that has happened since Mr. Mohamad was arrested on March the 1st of 2003. So the plane on September the 9th of 2006 takes Mr. Mohamad to Guantanamo Bay. It doesn't take him to New York. It doesn't take him to the federal courthouse at Foley Square that is very, very close to where the Twin Towers stood before they fell. It takes him to Guantanamo Bay. And it puts him there in a form of justice that was invented, not exactly out of whole cloth, but something very close to that, that was invented for the purposes of prosecuting these men in the War on Terror. And the reason that it was done is exactly what I was saying a moment ago. Because given the fact that there is no excuse for torture, that there's no argument of self-defense, there's no argument of justification for torture, and given the fact that there is universal jurisdiction, it becomes absolutely critical to United States interests that no one know what happened to Mr. Mohamad when he was in the black sites. Now, I know what happened to him. At least I know a version of it because I asked him about it. And early on in this case, I filed a motion and I asked the government to give me everything that they had that had to do with this subject, with this torture. And I asked them to file a motion and demanding that they present it to me, that they give it to me. And part of the motion was an attachment C, in which I prepared my own affidavit saying the things that Mr. Mohamad had told me had happened to him. And you'll see that this is up at the top. It's marked TSSCI, Top Secret Secure Compartmented Information, but it's been struck through because this is a declassified version of the affidavit. I filed this under seal. Yes, ma'am?
I'm sorry, does he become your client in 2006?
He became my client in 2008. Yeah. And so it's my declaration, the declaration of David Z. Nevin, and I'm an attorney. I practice law. At that point, Mr. Mohamad was representing himself, so I was advisory counsel to Mr. Khalid Shaikh Mohamad. I've been to Guantanamo. At that point, I'd been to Guantanamo 10 times. Now I think I've been 1,000 times. But nonetheless, and so I've interviewed Mr. Mohamad and have talked to him about where he was held. And based upon the foregoing information, I'm informed and believe the following concerning his capture, interrogation, and treatment. And I have some other information, other sort of qualifying stuff here that there may be more. I don't know if he told me everything and that, and so on. Now, I said, in this affidavit, in this declaration rather, I said that I was going to tell the things that had happened to Mr. Mohamad, and I did. I told them in this declaration, but I can't tell them to you because the government has classified them. And this is unprecedented in United States law, and I don't know if the country or countries that you live in where if this is permitted or not, but it's unheard of in the United States for the impressions, the memories, the recollections, the ideas of a human being to be classified. This has never happened in the history of the United States. And yet that's the position that the United States takes because he was subjected to the torture program. And the torture program is a secret program, and therefore he has secret, top secret information. Therefore, he can't be allowed to talk about it. In fact, the government filed a document in our case in which they referred to him as a participant in the torture program. They said Mr. Mohamad and the other 4 persons were participants in the torture program, and as a result of that, although they don't call it a torture program, but as a result of that, they acquired information about classified sources and methods. A participant, as if it were a fun run or a birthday party of some kind. And so this puts me in the position to say, look, if you didn't want him to know about your classified information, it's very simple. Don't show it to him. He didn't ask for the information. Not like me. I sign a non-disclosure agreement where I promise not to tell you, not you particularly, I promise not to tell anyone who doesn't have a security clearance and a need to know this kind of information. I did that because it was necessary for me to represent him, but not Khalid Sheikh Mohamad. This was all done against his will, I can tell you that much. So here's what he told me. And he was captured in Rawalpindi, Pakistan on or about March 1st, 2003. I've already told you that, so you know I can tell you that. And then the following things happened. Whoops, what am I doing? That's page 3. That's page 4. That's page 5 or 6. I must have hit 2 of them. And page 7. And now, at the end of all that black space, we get to the next thing I told you. In or about early September, he was transferred to Gitmo. And he's in the custody of the Central Intelligence Agency. And there are a few other facts here that I won't bore you with. And then, you know, I signed the thing. So this is what the CIA, this is what the government will let me say about what was done to Mr. Mohamad. And this is, you know, how they have responded to torture is to take every length to keep it secret. And it's all done, the proceedings at Guantanamo Bay are done to protect the torturers and to guarantee speedy convictions. In fact, when we first got to Guantanamo in May of 2008, late May of 2008 and early June, when we first got there, we found in one of the, behind a cupboard in one of the prosecution offices in a kind of a conference room area, we found a poster that had one of those timeline charts on it. And it showed that the government's intention was to have a first appearance in May, pretrial motions in June, jury selection in August, trial beginning at the end of August and being completed in September or perhaps early October, and death sentences by the second week of October. And you may remember that the second week of October would be 2 weeks before the 2008 presidential elections, in which President Obama was running against John McCain for the presidency. That was what the government had in mind. What is called in some places the rocket docket, in which everything would happen really fast. And that's where we found ourselves in the summer and the fall of 2008, but it didn't go that fast because we started making really basic assertions of rights. Mr. Mohamad didn't trust, he had no reason to trust me, of course. I'm an American. I mean, at that point, he was representing himself. And we were in the courtroom one day, and Mr. Mohamad raised his hand, and the judge recognized him, and he said, "Your Honor, I think you filed motions, you filed papers in this case." And the judge said, "Yes, yes, you do. And I can file these papers." "Yes, you can." And he says, "But I have no paper for filing these motions. I need paper." And the judge says, "I don't know, file a motion and ask for paper." And we all looked at each other dumbfounded and somewhat in horror. And the proceedings at Guantanamo speak of this remark of George Washington, and the blacking out on that document speak of this quote of George Washington, which is this: "Government is not reason, it is not eloquence, it is force. And like fire, it is a troublesome servant and a fearful master." And that was a motivating idea to the founding fathers of the United States. But I have a suspicion that 200 plus years of freedom and protection from the government has changed the mindset of the people in the country. And I'll say another word or two about that. But this is our courtroom at Guantanamo Bay, and what's most notable about it, and I will try to point this out, is there are 5, and there are actually 6 tables here. And this is a room that's about the size of half of a soccer field, something like that. This is a very big room. And there's a podium here where the lawyers speak. The prosecution sits over here. And these tables, each one of these tables is occupied by one of the defense teams. There are 5 defendants now in the 9/11 case. Each defendant is represented by somewhere between 3 and 7 or 8 lawyers. And there are also paralegals and investigators and translators, and there's a whole array of people which are behind the people who appear in court at these tables. The judge sits here, and there's a box here and a box here. And this box here is familiar to everyone because it's the witness stand. That's where witnesses who testify sit. This box here is less noticeable to people because it's the place where the court security officer sits. And right between the court security officer and the judge is what I call a hockey light. And I don't know if any of you are hockey fans, but when you score a goal in an ice hockey game, there's a little light behind the goal, a red light that goes round and round and round like this to indicate that a goal has been scored. Anyway, there's one of those that sits right there. And here's why. The gallery back here is walled off by soundproof glass, and the proceedings that occur here are piped out of here and into there on a 40-second delay because there are detainees present who have classified information in their heads, and what if they blurted out something about what they know, the classified information that they know. And so the man here to the right of the judge, if someone starts to say something that in his view is classified, he hits a button. The hockey light starts going off. If you're sitting back here, Lisa Hadjar can attest, there's a white noise generator, and you're seeing everything on a 40-second delay anyway, so when that button gets hit, the feed out of the courtroom stops, and it's no longer possible to know what's going on in the courtroom. And this courtroom was built specifically for the purpose of trying the 9/11 defendants. And back in 2008, of course, no photographs are allowed to be taken in the courtroom, but this is an artist's sketch, one that I'm not, hugely fond of, but it looks something like that, a crowd of people standing in front of a judge. These drawings, I think, are better. This is Molly Crabapple, and if you've ever seen any of her drawings, she's really quite a genius at catching the flavor of things. And this is somewhat the way Mr. Mohamad looks at various times in court. He has a tendency to blurt things out. I think he takes the position that it can't get any worse than this, and so it's all fine, your protocol and everything, but if he feels like saying something, he just says it, and doesn't worry much about the fallout. And victim family members, this happens to be a woman whom I'm acquainted with, and her daughter. Very interesting people. But what we do, this is all happening at Guantanamo Bay. And so you can't just go to Guantanamo Bay. You can't just buy a ticket to Guantanamo Bay. It's a naval base. And so every time we have hearings at Guantanamo Bay, we load up a big airplane, typically a military aircraft or a commercial a leased commercial airliner, and we fly judges and lawyers and defendants and, not defendants, but judges and lawyers and defense lawyers and prosecutors and press people and NGO observers and court clerks, and we fly an entire court system to Guantanamo every time we have a hearing at a cost of about $135,000 per flight. And we managed to dig our heels in the fall of 2008 so that instead of Mr. Mohamad getting tried and convicted and probably executed before the elections of 2008. That didn't happen. And in fact, President Obama was elected, as we know, and declared on his inauguration day that he was going to close the prison at Guantanamo within a year. And later that night, at about 10 o'clock that night, the prosecution filed a motion to indefinitely postpone the proceedings in our case, and everything went on hold for a while. And in fact, the government announced that they would be trying Mr. Mohamad in that civilian court in New York, which they might well have taken him to back in September of 2006, in the first place, in other words. This led to Eric Holder, the first black attorney general in the history of the United States, being hung in effigy in Foley Square in New York. I think what really collapsed the process was that Mayor Bloomberg, a few months later, decided, he intimated on a Thursday that that he wasn't sure it was all that great an idea to try these men in federal court. And then on that next Saturday, they announced that they were in fact not going to bring them to New York, but they were going to go back to the military commissions. You know, taking them to federal court, we've tried. There are several more. There are several more iterations of the terrorist trial report card, but the federal courts have handled, I think it's now approaching 1,000 terrorism cases, every one of them handled successfully and more or less fairly, and without any problems of any kind. And I don't know, personally, I interviewed a man who's part of would have led the Marshal Service delegation that would have provided security for the 9/11 trial in New York, and he said there would be no problem providing security for us for these proceedings in New York. But then politics intervened, and some of it was utterly irrational. But you know, in other words, the idea that we would all be in danger if these men were brought to the continental United States, which is silly on its face. If you've ever seen any discussions of the high security prison at Florence, Colorado, it's called ADX Florence. It's a supermax facility, it's called. No one's ever escaped from that. No one ever will escape from that. And it's probably more secure than Guantanamo is. It's not that. It isn't security. It's something else. And it's something to do with politics. And somehow the Republican Party managed to make it a matter of something akin to patriotism, to suggest that it would be appropriate to bring these cases to federal court in New York and not to leave them at Guantanamo. And the entire political mood of the country shifted in 2010 and in 2011. And in fact, then charges were preferred in 2011. They were referred in April of 2012. And in May of 2012, we were back at Guantanamo in some sort of a wretched deja vu experience for me, holding another arraignment in May of 2012. And since then, we've been engaged in litigation in what is easily the craziest lawsuit that I've ever been involved in. And I could go on long into the night, and I know you probably wish that I would, but instead, I'll just tell you quickly some of the crazy things that have happened. First, we've learned that the government has been eavesdropping on our meetings, on our conversations with each other, and our conversations with our clients. We meet with them in little huts, sort of little wooden huts in a protected, somewhat protected area. And there are smoke detectors in this room, and of course, as you may have read, we learned at some point that these smoke detectors were not really smoke detectors, but were actually microphones. And we learned that there was what was referred to as a sound field in the courtroom, so that even if I was whispering to somebody next to me, they could hear it in the microphones. They could hear everything that was said, no matter what it was. Very, very high tech, very impressive actually, microphones. And I was talking one day in court and saying some things, pretty innocuous things, and suddenly the hockey light went off. And remember the hockey light that I was telling you about before? The hockey light goes off, and I think, oh, wait, I didn't say anything wrong. What's the problem? And I look up at the court security officer, as if to say, Mike, what are you doing? And Mike's not looking at me, he's looking at the judge. So I look at the judge. And the judge is not looking at me either. The judge is looking at Mike, the court security officer. And pretty soon it becomes clear that neither one of them has pushed the button. They're both going like this. And I turn and I look at the prosecution side of the room, and they're all kind of like this. And it turns out that the CIA is in another place, and somehow the feed from the courtroom goes through their little trailer, the Central Intelligence Agency. It goes through their little trailer before it goes out. So they're deciding what the world gets to hear and what the world doesn't get to hear. We're told that the judge put a stop to that, and who knows? They infiltrated our defense teams. The FBI took aside one of the members of my team and one of the members of another team and asked them questions, frightened them, in other words, into giving information, confidential, privileged information about the operations of our defense teams. And they have a very competent, very capable young military lawyer on my team was simply removed from the team one day by the Army for bureaucratic convenience. They wanted him to go to some school so that he could learn to practice administrative law, which means, in other words, advising command structures about how to order pencils and this kind of thing. This is a capital defense lawyer in the largest criminal case in the history of the United States, who's developed a relationship with a man who's been tortured, which is the signal requirement for providing a competent defense. And he's just removed. And there's nothing that any of us were able to do about it. He's gone. And as I say, very literally, I could go on in this way for another until 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, that if you had been around criminal cases, you would know, and probably I could lay it out for you so that you would see that this is incredibly extraordinary. In a real criminal case, in a real courtroom, this would have all come to an end a long time ago. This case would have been dismissed if half of the things that I am talking about here had taken place. But half of them haven't happened. All of them have happened. So I do, from time to time, ask people if they think Mr. Mohamad should be executed, if they think my client, Khalid Sheikh Mohamad, should be executed. And you know, I usually see all the hands go up, just as I've have said, and they say, yes, he should be executed. But then I ask them, why do you think September 11th occurred? How many of you know why September 11th occurred? And they sit uncomfortably, and nobody raises their hand because they don't know why September 11th occurred. Even though it's very possible to know why September 11th occurred, they don't know. Because what they know, what the people in my country know, maybe what they care to know, is that September 11th occurred because they hate our freedoms. And in fact, we know we know it because Mr. Mohamad, back when he was representing himself, before I formally became his lawyer in this second round of the military commissions, actually filed a paper with the military commission saying why they conducted the attacks of September 11th. And you know, we have the way the law works in the United States in capital cases is this. There are two parts of the prosecution. One is called the guilt phase. One is called the penalty phase. And in the guilt phase, there's only just the question of whether you're guilty of the offenses that you're charged with. And in the penalty phase, we decide whether you will be sentenced to life imprisonment or whether you'll be killed. And so the law in the United States is very clear that in a capital case, no matter how bad it is, no matter how terrible the events that gave rise to the prosecution in the first place, during the penalty phase, if the person is convicted, during the penalty phase, we have to hear everything that the person has to say about why they shouldn't be executed, about why they ought to be sentenced to life, and instead of being sentenced to death. And you can say almost, you can say darn near anything you like. And there's a United States Supreme Court opinion called Skipper versus South Carolina that made this very, very clear, and it was the kind of the last in a fairly long line of U.S. Supreme Court cases that had hinted around at that idea, but then they finally directly held that in Skipper versus South Carolina. So if I want to tell you that I was born on a Tuesday, and that my favorite color is blue, and that the sun rises in the east, and therefore you shouldn't execute me, I get to do that. And most people don't do that, although there is a high incidence between capital criminality and mental illness. And so sometimes people do things that are kind of like that, or that are about as effective as that. But you are entitled to a genuine effort on the part of your lawyers to mitigate the offense. And so this is the idea of mitigation of punishment. And my own sense is that it's shameful that we don't know why September 11th occurred. And my own sense is that I'm going to make every effort to explain this, and I think it's important mitigation. I think maybe I said at the beginning that Mr. Mohamad had empowered me specifically to avoid having to say that I think September 11th was justified, because I don't think it was justified. I don't think in the guilt phase that any of the motivations and the reasons to act justify or excuse as a matter of law the attacks of September 11th. I don't believe that innocent people should be killed. I don't think it's right, and I don't think it's fair, and I don't think it's appropriate under any circumstances. But of course, what we tend not to know in the United States, after all, the Founding Fathers envisioned it as a continental nation, and the term "from sea to shining sea," which occurs in the national anthem, one effect of that is that we have a great big land mass that's all Americans, and we tend not to know or be very aware of what's happening in the rest of the world. That may come as a shock to some of you, but it's really true. And so we tend not to know about the Palestinian question, and we tend not to be aware of our role in permitting the creation of Israel in 1948 and leading to the expulsion of Palestinians and denying the right to return and capturing the property of Palestinians. And we tend not to be aware of that in the United States. That tends not to be on our radar, but that is on Mr. Mohamad's radar, and it's on many other people's radar. And I must say, you may know the writings of Noam Chomsky, and I've talked to him about his view in these areas, and the story that they hate our freedoms is one, of course, that has many other chapters to it. And I was in another country recently talking to a woman who was a cardiologist who told me that she was in her lab on September 11th, and she heard commotion down the hall, and she went there, and she found that this was on a television, and she found that as she stood there watching in horror, that she started hearing people saying, well, they're finally getting what they deserve. And she said, I understand their thinking. I understand their thinking. Because we know in the region, we know what the United States has been doing all these years. We know about the Iraq sanctions, and we know that 500,000 children under the age of 500,000 children under the age of 5 were killed by sanctions that the United States really kept the Security Council from from changing. And we know about Mohamad Mossadegh being overthrown in Iran in 1953, and the Shah being put on the throne, and the Savak coming into power, and how many people killed and tortured. And we know about the United States' support of brutal dictators in the region, whether it be Saddam Hussein or Mubarak or Assad, tamping down the Islamists from a strategic point of view. We know that the United States had a hand in the creation of Al-Qaeda. We know about the United States' terrible history in South America. We talked about Augusto Pinochet later, and we know that Mossadegh was about to nationalize the oil industry, and we know that that Pinochet was favorable to us and was able to get into a position to torture and kill thousands of people because of our assistance, because of the assistance of the Central Intelligence Agency. So we haven't been respecting the rule of law, and I put this quote up before, and I'm about to stop talking, and so I thought I'd return to it. That nothing is more common than for a free people in times of heat and violence to gratify momentary passions by letting into the government principles and precedents which afterwards prove fatal to themselves. And you may be sure that is happening in the United States. And partly it's because of a kind of a conservatism that exists in the United States right now politically. You may know that Republicans swept the midterm elections not that long ago, but at the same time that gay marriage and legalization of marijuana and increasing the minimum wage is surging through the country. So, you know, I don't know what it means, but there is a strong feeling that we can't afford civil liberties anymore. This is a quotation from DC Circuit Court of Opinion. And this is some kind of inside baseball here, but it'll give you an idea. The United States Supreme Court decided in the Boumediene case that detainees at Guantanamo Bay had the right to habeas corpus. And in other words, to go, the great writ, to go and present the demand that a court review whether or not they should be held in custody. And the government had claimed that they didn't have that right, but in Boumediene, the United States Supreme Court said, yes, you do. And the government must show by a preponderance of the evidence, in other words, that it's 51-49 more likely than not that you are engaged in terrorism or associated with Al-Qaeda or affiliated forces or whatever that language is from the authorization for the use of military force. We have to make that showing. But the DC Circuit is the one that reviews those cases. And here is Judge Silberman, who is one of 3 judges who is really deciding all of these cases in the DC Circuit, and he writes, "Candor obliges me to admit that you can't help but be conscious of how bad it will be if we let a terrorist out." And he says, "I doubt any of my colleagues will vote to grant a petition if he or she believes it somewhat likely, not more likely than not, but that it is somewhat likely that the petitioner is," there's very clearly what the DC Circuit is doing is they're applying a different standard. They're ignoring the United States Supreme Court. You know, we have a saying in the United States that widows and orphans make bad law. And what that means is that the court will bend the law to get to a result that there's a tendency for a court to do that. And you know, more than 50%, 53% of the people in the United States now believe that torture is justifiable under some circumstances. More than half the people in the United States believe that. Oh, that's the end of my slideshow. We're afraid in the United States. We're doing this because of fear. Much of the torture was undertaken, and I believe it's probably true, because of a fear of follow-on attacks, not because of some just gratuitous desire to inflict pain, but we know that anybody who knows anything about interrogation knows that that's not a good way to get useful information. But we're sanctioning indefinite detention. We have 149 men at Guantanamo Bay that have never been charged with anything, but that are held. They say that if my client, Khalid Sheikh Mohamad, is found not guilty, if that for some reason should happen, and I rather imagine that if it seemed that would be about to happen, he would save the government by getting up and saying, "No, I'm guilty." But suppose it did happen, they're not going to release him anyway. They don't think that they have to convict him in order to hold him forever for the rest of his life. So we've done real damage to the rule of law in the United States, and we've done it just as Alexander Hamilton predicted we would, or that we would have a tendency to. And so thanks for coming, and thanks for being interested in this, and thanks for being willing to talk about it. I very much appreciate your interest and attention. Thanks very much. Yeah, sure. So if anybody has questions, I would be glad to try to answer them if I can, if I'm allowed to. Sir?
Has the trial commenced? And secondly, could you explain a little bit about, for example, is the judge a lawyer or a military judge? Is there a jury? What is composed of the jury? And has there been a confession? Does the prosecutor say there has been a confession made by the client?
Yes. And so the question is, what's the process like? Who's the judge? Are there jurors? Has the trial started? What's kind of going on? The proceedings, the military commission proceedings, are based loosely on the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and those criminal prosecutions are usually referred to as court-martials. And so some of the same structure applies to the military commissions, and we do have a military officer who is the judge. His name is James Pohl. He's an Army colonel. And the jury will be made up of military officers. No, the trial has not started yet, and the trial is a long way from starting. We're still, because we chose to use a new and untested system in which only 2 cases have been tried, instead of using the federal court system that has existed for 200 years, we're going back. There are many things that determined, and many things, frankly, which had already been decided in the federal court system and would have resulted in greater protections, greater process protections. Whether and when the trial will start is a matter of some speculation. I think it's very hard to say when that will take place. We're a long way from having all of the elements in place to actually go forward with a trial right now.
Okay, just one last point.
Sure.
I won't interrupt you again. You know, as a Canadian, I listened to your President Bush use the same argument that they hate us from our freedom. It sounds like to a Canadian like the response to a 9-year-old child. It's, one can't believe that somebody would say that. So what do you say, without disclosing anything your client has told you, why do they hate us?
Well, I mean, I don't think, first of all, that it's exactly a matter of them hating us, but there is genuine anger about the actions that the United States has taken in the world, historically. And I referred to some of them previously, but we have acted, the United States acts very indiscriminately to do things that it sees as being in its own interest, and people get ground up in the process. And people get ground up and killed and harmed, and their lives get changed, and it happens by the thousands. And we've been doing it for years and years and years. And, you know, Ron Paul, who was a presidential candidate, probably not a very viable one in the last round of elections, said they don't hate us. They don't hate us because of our freedoms. Sweden has all the same freedoms we have, and they're not attacking Sweden. And furthermore, if you don't want them to attack you anymore, just stop doing the things that cause them to attack you. It's all very simple, and you don't have the right to do them in the first place. And there are, I mean, you know, there's lots more that can be said about this, and will be. Anybody else? Sir?
What influence or authority does President Obama have over any of this process? Guantanamo, the trial.
So the question I have over all of this, and the trials, Guantanamo Bay, that kind of thing. And the answer is that he has absolute, utter, complete, total power to do whatever he wants, whenever he wants to do it. Now, you may well have asked, as a practical matter, what power does he have? And my reading of a very interesting book called Kill or Capture that was written by Daniel Klaidman is that Rahm Emanuel, the White House Chief of Staff at the time, made a choice to give up Guantanamo Bay in favor of health care. And you can argue whether that's a good choice or not. I have a feeling about it, although I believe that universal health care is hugely important to our country. And that may be wrong. Obviously, I wasn't in the White House. But the strictly correct answer is that President Obama could issue an executive order tomorrow morning and end this whole thing. Now, the government, the Congress in the United States has the power of the purse. So to some extent, there would have to be some maneuvering to find money to do the things that the president would like to do. But that's, strictly speaking, is the answer. Yeah. Sir? Yeah.
Along these lines, I take it you think that if it were in a normal Article III court, that the judge probably would uphold rule of law principles in this case? And secondly, do you think that a military judge, I don't know if you want to, you're in a specific situation, but are they unlikely to have the same values about rule of law?
Well, military are people. They are lawyers. And I have found that our military judge is willing to listen and and I think is a smart man. And of course, my position is that whenever he doesn't agree with me, he's off in left field. But truthfully, I think he is a very capable man. And I think that he is willing to participate in the discussion, And, the rule of law, I say this frequently, that justice in the United States is not a result, it's a process. So we have a process, we follow it in every case, and what happens at the end of that, if we followed our process faithfully and honorably, is justice, quote unquote. So we were talking before in a class that I was at about the distinction between blameworthy and guilty. Guilty is a word that means you've been found guilty in a fair trial, or you've pled guilty knowingly and voluntarily. That's different from blameworthy, because plenty of blameworthy people get found not guilty, and plenty of people who didn't do anything get found guilty. The system's not perfect. It has a lot of slack in it. They're human beings at every turn in our criminal justice system. But what we've done here at Guantanamo is we've hijacked the existing rule of law and put in a system that I think the government believed was more certain to result in convictions. And I really think that our judge does not want to be the one who is left holding the bag for this. I think he is going to hold the government's feet to the fire. I hope he will, and I believe he will. His hand was up just a moment ago, if you don't mind. I'll get back to you.
Yeah, I have a two-part question. One, the first is related to this sort of extrajudicial procedure. We just had the ruling from the D.C. court that was about a potential Al-Qaeda person. And you yourself said that you don't think that killing of quote-unquote innocent people is appropriate under any circumstances. Well, is this not something that has sort of gone on in recent history? For example, the Irish civilians go up and shoot British soldiers in the head. You could make the argument that they were innocent. A slave who burned the house down and killed everyone in it so that the slaves could escape. one would assume that that would not then immediately deprive one of the right to a trial, and that it wouldn't simply come in the sentencing phase, whether or not you were executed, that might in fact be in the earlier phase. And that leads to the second question, which is this new Guantanamo system in which you're participating, do you find it's appreciably different from, say, the Egyptian system under which the Al Jazeera reporters were just convicted? And if not, you just see this as an aberration like Dred Scott, Plessy v. Ferguson, the Japanese detentions in World War II, the Gore case, and it's all going to right itself somehow?
Yeah.
I hope everybody heard it because I have no chance of repeating it. But there's some really interesting ideas in that, and it's really, I mean, really, obviously, it's the exposition of some ideas as opposed to a question. But I think that this system that we're operating under at Guantanamo, not only as designed but also as implemented, has similarity to what we would call substandard justice systems all over the world, and there are plenty of them. And I don't think I'm in a position, I don't know enough to comment on the similarity to the Egyptian system, but that's the problem. That's the thing that the United States has always prided itself on, is the rule of law. And we operate according to the rule of law. It's a government of laws, not of men. There are many sort of platitudes about that. But that's what we fly in the face of when we do something like Guantanamo Bay, when we do a little side detour into a system like this that is less robust than it should be. And what was your second point?
Well, it actually is, to follow up, is the idea that the United States is making an exception because this is an exceptional case, and the United States is an exceptional country, when in fact similar sorts of things have been going on all over the world, and now that they apparently are going on in the United States, then the United States judicial system, on which it's prided itself and defined itself, can go out the window.
Yes, exactly. That is very well said. I don't think
that wasn't a question.
I don't think I really don't think I need to add anything to that, sir.
I have a question. That's good. I do believe what you tended to say is that the Obama administration traded healthcare for closing Guantanamo Bay.
Yeah.
But then about 3 years ago, I thought they put in a Supreme Court attorney in charge of getting the system rolling in Alsaud.
Yes.
And has that resulted in anything? I thought there was a phase 2 here where we're trying to.
Yeah. Yes. And the president has said very recently that he wants to close, he still wants to close Guantanamo, and he's in the lame duck now, and he's talking about imposing immigration reform via executive order, and so the thought is that he may be moving in this direction. And I know that I've talked to some people who have talked to him privately who suggest that he might be willing to go forward. Now,
and then use federal court procedures?
Maybe bring the military commissions to the continental United States, maybe, and maybe make them more robust in terms of their procedural protections, maybe. But there'd be many different ways for him to approach that, I think. Yeah. Yes, sir?
Excuse me, did the government ever admit to torturing Mr. Mohamad?
Well, the government has declassified some facts about his torture. So the government has declassified the fact that he was waterboarded 183 times during the month of March of 2003. And waterboarding is it's been called the water torture at other times, but it's a mock execution, taken right to the brink of death and then revived and then drowned again, 183 times. They've declassified the fact that there was 120 hours of continuous sleep deprivation at one time, and it's been declassified that they threatened to kill his family if he didn't cooperate, and they did, in fact, torture his children. So they don't admit, however, the government does not tend to admit that that is torture as such. They say that that is extraordinary. This is policy making by euphemism. So in other words, these are referred to as enhanced interrogation techniques, EITs, as opposed to torture. I don't think the government concedes that it's torture. However, the government does allow me, think of that, the government does allow me to say that in my opinion he was tortured, that what was done to him meets the definition of torture under international instruments.
Is that the basis for civil litigation then?
Probably not, for a whole bunch of both practical and legal reasons. Yes, ma'am?
Do you think that American concern for justice reflects the situation, that it's influenced by, let's say, recession, that it becomes less in times of recession, that it might become more in times of pity? I mean, do you think there's a relationship there?
Yes, ma'am, I do. If I were a really good computer person, I could, I did. But I'm not a really good computer person. But this is the basic idea of this. And I think absolutely any people who are put under pressure in various ways have less energy for being gracious and hospitable and fair to other people when they feel oppressed or when they feel when they're struggling, including financially. But the crash of 2008 had an impact here as well, I believe. I believe you're absolutely right.
So maybe one more question.
Sure.
I guess my question is whether you see Guantanamo as a perversion or a failing of American ideals and American history, or as sort of a natural point of progression in
Right.
American history. I mean, given that sort of agonizing litany of American offenses against the rule of law around the world and mention of Japanese internment camps.
Right.
Is Guantanamo something new, or is it just kind of the next thing in a long chain of similar things?
This is one of the things that really worries me about this case, is that what is happening in this case will end up happening in regular cases back in the United States. That in the ordinary cases where the rubber meets the road, in little courtrooms all over the United States, that there will be an erosion of due process, of the due process requirements. And I think that's what this quote, you know, these guys are saying, yeah, but I mean, in cases of terrorism, gee, we really hate to just, you know, actually apply the law. I mean, we wouldn't really want to do that. And, because, I mean, it's awfully risky. And you know, this is what Hamilton is talking about, is that we give up when the going gets tough. And I'm very afraid that that's what's going to happen. I think there's reason to hope that it won't. And I think that if we can stop the military commission's process, and if a jury could be convinced not to execute Mr. Mohamad, which I think would be terrible policy and just a terrible outcome all the way around. If a jury could be convinced not to execute him, I think that might have the effect of, that might really improve the situation.
Well, thank you so much. It's been.
I'm sorry I didn't